Education is quickly changing in the United States. It's hard for parents to keep up with what their children are learning in school, and it's even harder to understand the national trends in education and where they're taking our children and our country. I hope that today is the day that we will resolve to take ownership over the education of our children. So let's start by trying to understand what's happening in our public schools. Hello, my name is Jane Robbins, and I'm with the American Principals Project. I have a disturbing story to tell, a story about the Common Core state standards, how they were foisted on the states by the federal government and by well-funded private interests in Washington. We need to realize that the Common Core will strip our states of their constitutional authority over education. Parents will no longer be able to control or even influence what their children are taught. The Common Core scheme will ultimately empower the federal government to control school curricula in violation of 3 federal statutes. Parents need to know how Common Core standards will ultimately narrow the curriculum and prepare our children to be cogs in a national industrial system rather than full citizens in a free republic. Taxpayers need to know how the Common Core leads to national testing that will impose substantial costs on state and local school budgets. Parents need to know how the massive student data tracking system will contribute to the loss of student and family privacy. Citizens need to understand how this new educational direction will gradually guide the next generation away from our free enterprise system and into a managed economy. All this is supposedly the price we have to pay to ensure that our children are better prepared to compete in the global economy. Join me as I explain what is a very real threat to the United States education system.
Jane, I don't know too much about the Common Core. Could you just start by defining what we are talking about exactly?
The Common Core State Standards Initiative is currently a set of national common K-12 content standards in English language arts and math, ideally to be adopted in all 50 states so that education will be standardized throughout the country. The supposed purpose of the Common Core is to impose rigorous standards so that our students will be better prepared for competing in the global economy and to allow comparison of student performance among states. Common Core standards have currently been adopted by 45 states and the District of Columbia.
So what's the problem with nationally standardized content standards? I heard that the states work together to create these standards.
Common Core proponents claim that Common Core was led by the states, but this simply isn't true. The real drivers of the Common Core were the same advocates of a national school curriculum who have been around for years in various guises. They tried and failed to impose a national curriculum in the past, for example with the national history standards in the 1990s, which were so politically correct and anti-American that they were rejected by the U.S. Senate 99-1. The national curriculum advocates learned 3 things from past failures. First, don't call the curriculum standards national or federal. Second, impose them quickly and quietly before the people and their representatives find out about it. And 3, don't start with a controversial subject such as history. Start instead with math and English.
Can you identify a few of these groups of people and why they seem so motivated to take over the curriculum standards in all 50 states?
This most recent effort of progressive education reformers is primarily connected with a nonprofit group in Washington, D.C. called Achieve, Inc., which wrote the national standards, with lavish funding from private foundations, especially the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They realized the need to make this look like a state-generated initiative, so they went to the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers, both of which are D.C.-based trade associations, and neither of which had a grant of legislative authority from states to write national school standards. But because the Common Core standards were created under their auspices, the proponents now claim that the effort was state-led. The real power here is the Gates Foundation, which has spent over $100 million helping create and propagate the standards, and has plans to spend many millions more. But over the long haul, with all the technology and new curriculum that this new educational paradigm requires, companies such as Microsoft will more than recover the money they have invested. There is a great deal of money to be made at the educational trough.
I'm trying to understand how these private groups could have so much influence over 50 states. Is the federal government involved in this?
Secretary of Education Arne Duncan is a huge proponent of Common Core, and under his direction, the Federal Department of Education has used its power of the purse to essentially bribe states to adopt the standards. In the spring of 2009, the infamous stimulus bill gave the Department of Education a $4.35 billion earmark, money to use however the department wanted. The department created the Race to the Top competition, whereby the federal government took our money and gave us the chance to compete to get some of it back. States could apply for Race to the Top grants, but to have a realistic shot at getting the money, they had to agree to adopt the Common Core standards and the national tests, the assessments aligned with the Common Core, all sight unseen, because at that time the standards had not even been completed and the testing component is still not complete. The Race to the Top application came out in November 2009 and completed applications were due only 2 months later. Now remember, at that time the country was in a deep recession and states were desperate for money. It's also important to note that between the months of November and early January, most state legislatures are not in session. So desperate state officials had to decide without consulting their legislatures whether to commit to the Common Core and all it entails in order to get Race to the Top money. In Georgia, the decision to apply for Race to the Top money was made by Governor Sonny Perdue and State School Superintendent Kathy Cox. Yet Kathy Cox, of all people, should know that content standards that cannot be changed by the states cannot work in the long run. In 2004, then Superintendent Cox canceled plans to use reading and writing standards developed for K-3 grades by the National Center on Education and the Economy. Why? Because that organization would not agree to let the state change its standards in any way. Cox stated that the state of Georgia, quote, had some real trouble going forward with a document we weren't going to be able to change, close quote. The State Board threw out a $125,000 contract and brought together a group of Georgia teachers to come up with new standards. And here we go again, getting into the same mess, yet deeper this time around. The Common Core standards were finally released in June 2010, and states were given 2 summer vacation months to get their state school boards to sign off on the Common Core commitment, again with no involvement by the legislature. In Georgia, the state school board signed off on the Common Core in just 1 month. The other way the federal government is promoting Common Core is through No Child Left Behind waivers. The U.S. Department of Education is encouraging states to adopt Common Core in order to qualify for a waiver from the most demanding provisions of No Child Left Behind. Georgia received both Race to the Top funding and a No Child Left Behind waiver. So it is firmly shackled to the Common Core and the aligned national tests unless the legislature does something to change it.
It's obvious that these federal grants usurp legislative authority and make state control irrelevant. What about the national testing? What are the concerns associated with the testing aspect of the Common Core?
2 consortia of states have hired so-called testing experts to create national tests aligned with the Common Core. One is called the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, and the other is the Partnership for Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers, better known as PARCC, P-A-R-C-C. These will all be computerized tests, so school districts will have to acquire and maintain the technology necessary for testing all students in most grades multiple times per year. Georgia is a member of PARCC, which means we've agreed to implement the PARCC national test by the school year 2014-15.
Who's paying to develop these tests?
The U.S. Department of Education gave the 2 consortia $360 million for test creation. Now, once that money runs out, the states that are members of the consortia will have to assume the costs. These types of computer-driven tests are far more expensive than traditional testing, and there has not been a candid discussion on the ongoing costs this creates for taxpayers. Something to consider about the people developing these PARCC and Smarter Balanced tests. The PARCC tests are being designed by the same group of progressive reformers that gave us the Common Core standards. With respect to Smarter Balanced, the most influential person there is a radical Stanford professor named Linda Darling Hammond, who has partnered with Bill Ayers, yes, that Bill Ayers, in the past on some of his education projects, and who is basically opposed to testing students at all. Under her direction, the Smarter Balance test will probably lower the bar on student academic expectations and instead focus on subjective performance-based outcomes. So we ought to question whether these tests are even going to test the type of academic knowledge that students ought to have.